Well, it is very hard to believe that we have actually, as of today, we're coming to the end of our Game of Stones series. We've been working through the 10 Commandments, actually, for the last 12 weeks. Today is the 12th week. And today we're going to be looking at the commandment that we skipped over during our Summer Kids Week, and that is Commandment number 8. And I really want to encourage you, I know most of you are aware of this, but if you have missed some of the messages in this series this year, all of them are available to download on our website. And I'd encourage you to do that, put them on your iPod or on your phone and enjoy them on your way to work or when you're driving around in the car. Well, I don't know how many of you remember this story that came out a few years back about a bank robbery that happened in Ottawa that was committed by this guy named Danny Sampson. Anyone remember that story? I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah, some of you do. Well, as some of you would know, as his story is told, he was this guy, he was down on his luck. He had been laid off from his job. He had bills to pay. He had a family to feed. And he really didn't see any other option for getting money that he needed other than to steal a fairly large sum of cash. So as the story goes, he had an old hand-me-down Colt 45 that he'd actually gotten passed down from his grandfather, and went into the bank and actually got about $6,000 when he robbed the bank. But when the RCMP eventually tracked him down and they confiscated the gun that he used, they immediately sent that gun to the lab, and the individual who was examining that gun was also an amateur gun collector and was quite shocked when he realized what he was in fact holding in his hand, because this hand-me-down Colt 45 was worth in excess of $100,000. So it's interesting because Danny was actually wealthy, and he didn't even realize it. Well, that's a funny story, but I mean, not as funny as the story of Dennis Quigley. Dennis owned a fairly large motorhome, and one night when he was sleeping in his motorhome, he heard a thief trying to siphon gas from where it was parked in a small camping area just outside of Seattle. Well, when Dennis heard the noises outside, he grabbed his bat, he kept it beside his bed, and went outside expecting a confrontation. But when he went out to investigate the noises, he opened the door to discover that the thief was curled on the ground in the fetal position, vomiting violently. Well, as it turns out, the thief was intending to suck up the contents of the gas tank, but he had accidentally put the hose into the wrong hole and ended up sucking up the contents of the sewage tank instead. Well, this thief, who was a young man of 17 that was trying to steal gas for his vehicle, was released from the hospital some 11 days later. And Dennis and the police decided that the guy had been through enough. They decided not to prosecute him, agreeing that probably he got what he deserved in that moment. But, we can sit back and we can laugh at those stories. But as we're going to look at this morning, stealing in Scripture was not seen as a laughing matter. In fact, it was serious enough that God actually chiseled it into those stone tablets as the 8th important commandment that he wanted the nation of Israel to grasp. And as we're soon going to see, those words really did mean so much more than simply don't take something that doesn't belong to you. The 8th commandment is found in Exodus 20, verse 15, and simply it reads this way, just 4 words: you shall not steal. I know when we get to this specific commandment, it might be easy for most of us to sort of sit back and think, well, I really don't need to worry about this one. After all, I'm not a thief. I earn my living honestly. I make money the old-fashioned way. I earn it. And maybe you're even sitting there thinking to yourself, I don't rob banks. I don't steal paper clips and tape from my employer. I'm not like those corporate embezzlers either. But one of the things that we quickly learn about this commandment, this commandment about stealing, is that it meant so much more to the people of Israel because it was seen as being such a very personal statement to them, because their view of stealing was so closely tied to their view of possessions. So this is what I want you to keep in mind as we're talking about this morning. Keep in mind that they were receiving all of these commandments, as we've reminded you on a number of occasions this summer. They were just 8 weeks from being released as slaves from Egypt. So we're talking about a community that likely had very few possessions to begin with. And when you think about it, it was just weeks earlier that they themselves were considered possessions. Possessions to be bought and sold and abused at the whim of the person from Egypt that actually owned them. So this whole concept of owning possessions was likely something that was still being formulated in the heads of the nation of Israel. So think about this with me. If you were the head of a household, maybe you were a husband or wife and you had a few kids, and collectively you had just weeks earlier been released from slavery. Just taking the things that you could carry on your back and the things that, and to top all that off, the leader that you are following is telling you not to collect more than one day's food because God will provide for your daily needs. Imagine that that is your context. That is the world that you live in. That is your daily reality. And you are standing by the foot of Mount Sinai, and you actually hear these words from God saying, do not steal. I wonder, what are you likely thinking at that moment? You might be thinking, I better not even think about taking my neighbor's sheep for food. I better not even consider taking my neighbor's blankets for warmth at night. But you're also probably thinking, I hope that no one takes any of the few possessions that I have that I need in order to provide for my family. Right? Those are likely all thoughts that are running through your head at that moment. In a sense, God is likely giving them this commandment as a way of saying to them, remember that I promised I would provide all of your needs. Remember, you can trust that I will give you and your family exactly what it is that they need. They're likely thinking, in a sense, God is saying, you have no need to take what doesn't belong to you because I will provide everything that you need, just as I have promised. In a sense here, I think God is trying to shape their worldview of possessions. And he's saying to them, let's figure this out now as our journey together is just beginning. That I will take care of you and you can trust me to do that. Well, I'm not sure that that message actually ever sank into the nation of Israel. Because it becomes obvious as you read more and more of the nation of Israel's story in the Old Testament that this was going to become a huge issue for God's chosen people. And it would come up again and again and again. And more you start to see that He keeps giving them direction to follow up what this commandment really means. And here's a couple of examples. So in Exodus 22, we're told that when someone stole from someone else, there was something called this law of restitution that was supposed to kick in at that point. And this meant that if someone was caught stealing from someone else, then that individual had to restore the stolen property and add 20% before he or she would be allowed to offer what they called a guilt offering to the Lord. But there was still more, because still in Exodus 22, it says that if a sheep or an ox is stolen, then killed and the meat sold, the thief must pay back with 5 oxen or 4 sheep. And if he couldn't produce it, then he himself was to be sold to pay the debt. If the animal was recoverable while it was still alive, the thief must pay back double. But there was still more, because in Numbers chapter 5, we're told that if a person took something and actually turned himself in before he was caught, we're told that that repentant thief would only have to give back 1/5 on top of what he took. So when you boil all of this down, what God is trying to impress upon the nation of Israel, and I believe us as well, are a few things. Firstly, he's saying that if you steal, you're really saying that I don't trust God's provision for me. I don't really believe that he cares for me. I really don't believe that he's looking out for me. I don't trust him. The second thing he's saying, and it's important to understand that when people stole from one another back then, that they are really robbing each other of their part in the promise that God had made back to Abraham and Moses. So the people back then actually viewed these thefts as being stealing from God as much as it was stealing from your neighbor. So if God had promised to give his chosen people something like land and food, which he did, and then someone else came along and stole that thing from them, the item was actually seen as a theft of something that God had provided to that neighbor. And the consequences continued to get more and more and more severe throughout the Old Testament. Well, the third thing, and this is the thing that I want us to camp on for a while this morning, is that this commandment was an attempt to remind people that they were living in a community where the actions of individuals impact the quality of life for everyone. Let me say that again. This commandment was an attempt to remind the people that they were living in a community where the actions of individuals impacted the quality of life for everybody. So as much as this commandment was being spoken to individuals, and God was in fact saying to them, "You shall not steal," it's also important to note that in the original Hebrew word that's used here in this commandment, that it carries with it this corporate or this community implication as well. So it's saying, don't steal from each other because the actions of one will impact everyone. Remember that God is in the process of taking these spiritual infants, and out of this community, he wanted to build a great nation that would do what? That would reflect him well. He was building them to be this great nation, but he was also building them to be his family that would claim his name. And as much as the 10 Commandments were intended to guide how individuals were to act, as we've been talking about this summer, they were also intended to act as this moral compass for this new faith community. So God just wasn't looking for individuals and saying, don't steal from each other. He was really speaking to the whole community and saying, don't treat one another like that. Don't covet what your neighbor has. Don't take the things that don't belong to you. In fact, he's really taking it even a step further than that. And he's saying that when a culture permits theft, when it permits stealing, when it lets thieves take things that don't belong to them, and when the community starts to value possessions and stuff over people and relationships, that things in that community will begin to fall apart. You know, one of the best examples of what this commandment is really talking about is found in the book of Joshua, chapter 7, and it's the story of a man whose name was Achan. Now, I need to let you know that Achan is no relation to the Anshan family that we have here, which I know it sounds similar, but I checked with Ancestry.com this past week, and according to them anyways, there's absolutely no connection between these families. Although I do feel the need to offer one of those character disclaimers that you typically see at the end of a movie or a TV show to prevent Waverley from possibly being sued. So here it goes. All characters appearing in the remainder of this sermon are Old Testament characters whose story is told in Joshua chapter 7. Any resemblance to people, persons living or dead, is purely coincidental. And there were no animals injured during the preparing of this sermon. So now that we've got that out of the way, let me set this story up for you, because when we pick it up, Joshua and the nation of Israel have just watched God miraculously level the walls of Jericho. If you remember a few months back during our Hero series, we talked about that story. Remember the ladder fiasco? When I tried to illustrate how tall the walls of Jericho were, only to discover my ladder wasn't big enough? Well, it was that story that we talked about on that Sunday. Well, when Israel conquered Jericho, they were instructed very clearly by God not to take the spoils of that city. But one guy, because there's one in every crowd, isn't there, didn't listen, and his name was Achan. The story tells us, starting in verse 1 of Joshua chapter 7, the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zermi, the son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. So first of all, I'm wondering, do you find that interesting that God was in fact mad at all of Israel? I mean, why Israel? Why not just Achan? After all, it was him that took some of the spoils from Jericho. It wasn't everybody else. So why was God mad at everyone? Well, when you start to understand why God was angry, you begin to grasp that there are certain sins that impact the whole community and not just the individuals that commit that sin. And this was one of them. Verse 2. Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, to the east of Bethel, and told them, go up and spy out the region. So the men went up and spied out Ai. When they returned to Joshua, they said, not all the army will have to go up against Ai. Send 2,000 or 3,000 men to take it, and do not weary the whole army, for only a few people live there. So up to this point, Joshua was 1-0 in wins and losses with his big win at Jericho. But up the hill, about half a mile high and 12 miles away, was this small city called Ai. And God had told him that that was going to be the next city that they were going to conquer. And it was a fairly small city. So these verses tell us that Joshua sends some spies up to stake out the next land that they're going to conquer. And basically, these spies come back and say, we got this one. This one should be really easy. It'll be no contest. In fact, let's just send a small portion of our men, and let's let the rest of the army take a bit of a break. So Joshua takes their advice, and they only send about 3,000 soldiers up to the men of Ai. Verse 4 continues, and one of the things that they're assuming is that God is with them because they had seen him do some incredible things with Jericho. So they're thinking, why wouldn't God give us that same kind of victory? Verse 4. So about 3,000 men went up, but they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36 of them. They chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, their undefeated streak has just ended, and now they're 1-1. And what's worse is the fact that they were beaten by this little town of Ai. And after beating the regional giant Jericho, I mean, I'm sure that the people of Ai felt a lot like the 0-9 Saskatchewan Roughriders preparing to play Winnipeg this afternoon. They hadn't won a game all year, and yet they walked in and they walked away with this victory. And we hope that that's not a foreshadowing of what's going to happen this afternoon. But can you imagine how Joshua and the Israelites must have felt? Just a few days earlier, they had seen the walls of Jericho crumble before them. And really, they didn't even have to lift a finger for it, did they? It was all God, and they knew that it was all God. In that miraculous and awesome display of power, God brings these walls down, and Joshua and his armies are likely feeling in that moment invincible. They're feeling indestructible. Their faith and their confidence in God, it could not have been stronger than likely it was after that had happened. And then this happens. Joshua was likely not only confused, but he was probably exasperated. He was mad, and he wanted answers from God. Verse 6 continues with the story, and we're told, then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? So God, can you picture this? He's sitting back patiently listening to Joshua go on and on and on until finally, in essence, he responds to Joshua by saying, stop feeling sorry for yourself. You are not the victim here. In verse 10, the Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. He's saying, remember those 10 commandments that I gave you on Mount Sinai? Remember those commandments that were intended to be the moral compass for my chosen people? Well, Joshua, not everybody gets that yet. And then God gets very specific with Joshua. And he tells him this: they have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. So God says, Joshua, I am not the one that has abandoned you here. You and these chosen people have abandoned me. And what he's really trying to impress upon them here is that the sin of an individual cannot do anything but hurt the community as a whole. So God tells Joshua what he needs to do. He says, go consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. In the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord chooses shall come forward, clan by clan. The clan the Lord chooses shall come forward, family by family. And the family of the Lord that the Lord chooses shall come forward man by man. He's weeding it down. He's weeding people out. Whoever is caught with the devoted things shall be destroyed by fire, along with all that belongs to him. He has violated the covenant of the Lord and has done an outrageous thing in Israel. So Joshua apparently makes arrangements to have all of this happen the following day, which I'm sure was no easy feat because there were well over 1 million of them. And by the next day, people start to line up, tribe by tribe, clan by clan, family by family, and then individual by individual. And you could just see all of this play out in front of everybody's eyes as people start to get weeded out, and the number is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. We're told in verse 16, early the next morning, Joshua had Israel come forward by tribes, and Judah was chosen. The clans of Judah came forward, and the Zeharites were chosen. He had the clan of the Zeharites come forward by families, and Zermi was chosen. Joshua had his family come forward man by man, and Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zermi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, was chosen. And the whole nation of Israel is watching this. And it's just Joshua and Achan standing face to face with one another. Verse 19. Then Joshua said to Achan, my son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and honor him. Tell me what you have done. Do not hide it from me. Achan replied, it is true, I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I have done. When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them, and I took them. They are hidden in the ground inside my tent with the silver underneath. So Joshua at this point sends some people to Achan's tent, and there they find the stolen items. They collect them, they bring them back to Joshua, and Joshua has all of these stolen goods spread out on the ground so that everybody can see them. And the passage actually says, and I love this, it says that they were spread out before the Lord. So the Lord could see them. Verse 24, then Joshua, together with all Israel, took Achan, son of Zerah, the silver, the robe, the gold bar, his sons, his daughters, his cattle, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that he had to the valley of Achor. Joshua said, "Why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you today." And then all Israel stoned him, and after they had stoned the rest, they burned them. Over Achan they heaped a large pile of rocks, which remains to this day. The Lord turned from his fierce anger. Therefore that place has been called the Valley of Achor ever since. So tell me, what was the real issue here? What made this issue so serious that it warranted this kind of public display? This type of punishment? What was it? Well, I want to suggest to you that this 8th commandment that says, "Thou shalt not steal," is a manifestation of something greater that God wants all of us as his followers to understand. In fact, the big picture that God is trying to get across to them is this: that as his followers, we need to abandon our quest to find meaning in the ownership of possessions. God is saying, believe me when I say to you that you can put your trust in me and I will meet all of your needs. He's saying, understand that when you steal from someone, you are screaming to the mountaintops that I, your God, am incapable of doing for you what I said I would do, and that's to provide for your every need. I want to suggest to you that the nation of Israel is likely needing a very dramatic visual illustration at this moment to help them grasp this. You know, a visual illustration like when God sent the plagues. A visual illustration like when God parted the Red Sea and then closed it up again, destroying the entire Egyptian army. A visual illustration like when Moses came down from the mountain with God to the thunder and the lightning. And a visual illustration like they had experienced just weeks before, when the walls of Jericho came crashing down. God is telling the nation of Israel here that the stuff you steal for, the stuff your neighbor has that you covet after, the silver that we all look at and say, who would it really hurt if I took just a little? God is saying none of it will do for you what you are thinking it will. He's saying that it's not about the stuff that you steal. It is entirely about why you steal it in the first place. It's because you love things more than me. It's because you love the possessions and you don't trust me enough to provide for all of your needs. Let me ask you, is this really a big issue in our community, in the greater community today? Well, consider this with me. There was a study done back in 2009 where it was determined that 1 out of every 52 shoppers that walks into your local Walmart or any other store will carry out something with them that they did not pay for. In fact, in the U.S. alone, there are 4 million people caught shoplifting every year. But for every one caught, it's estimated that there are 51 that actually get away with it. In the U.S., the IRS estimates that 1 in 3 people cheat on their taxes, and they do so to the tune of about $300 billion a year. A recent hotel chain opened up a huge hotel in Las Vegas and recently reported that after the first 10 months of operation, they had lost 38,000 spoons, 18,000 towels, 355 silver coffee pots, 1,500 finger bowls, and 100 Bibles. And according to a recent government survey, a recent government study, stealing, including everything that we've just talked about here, costs the average North American family $17 per day, or $4,100 per year, usually in inflated store prices that need to compensate for people stealing. So I ask you, is this a community issue? And please hear this morning, that this commandment is not just talking about shoplifting and illegally downloading music and cheating on your taxes and stealing hotel towels. But this commandment is challenging you and I to become the kind of community that reflects him well. It's challenging you and I to join this new kingdom of God that Jesus came to earth to bring, that places value on people rather than on possessions. It's challenging us to ask God this question: do I really trust you enough that you are going to look after my daily needs? It is my prayer that each of us will be able to answer that with an absolutely yes. Let's pray.